didn't seem to mind them too awful bad. Even now, I can only eat brown beans, pinto beans every once in a while with a pound of cornbread, and it better have something, some kind of a ham bone or something in it. Okay, it better have something in it to give it some flavor, or else I can't eat it. Can you imagine eating? I don't care if angels ate it. I don't care if it rained down from heaven. If you had to eat it for 40 years, do you think that you'd be happy with it? After a while, you'd probably find yourself getting tired of it. So what I want to emphasize is, while it's real easy to come down hard on the Hebrews for the way that they behave themselves, it is quite likely that in the same boat, in the same condition, you'd be the same way. The Bible talks about the flavor of it was great. Apparently it was very sweet. Apparently it was good for different forms of baking, and it was sustaining to the point that they were able to live off of this without very much else by way of food. Now, there are traditions. If you look into the Catholic Church, they believe that it was completely consumed by the body to the point where there was no waste from the body. I don't know if that's the case. That's just, but we do know that there was that it was completely everything that they needed. Now, there is a comparison. If you read the chapter 6 of the book of John, John chapter 6, you find a great deal of imagery to bread. Jesus was born in the house of bread, right? Bethlehem actually means house of bread. The point, he says that he is the true bread that comes down from heaven. Okay? We don't think in the same terms that people thought in bygone ages. We have been exposed to multiple different types of food. How many people like Italian? You like Italian? Italian food was God's gift to man. Okay? I love Italian food. I love it. You've got Mexican food. You've got Oriental type food. Never was a big fan of Asian type food, but some people really love it. We, in this, especially in the multicultural area of America that we live, we're exposed to a great deal of different types of food, diversity. And my father-in-law used to say, quote the saying that variety is the spice of life. What happened is, however, it has made us a little bit discontent. It has. It's made us picky. We find some things that we like, and because we're exposed to more, we want that variety. We're easily bored. Years ago, people were only exposed to certain very small types of food. About every plate was set with, or every table was set with either biscuits or cornbread, right? If you had brought out a lasagna, people wouldn't have known, they couldn't have said it, much less wanted to eat it. They ate what grew in a garden, right? They ate corn, they ate tomatoes, cucumbers, okra. Where in the world people started eating okra from, I don't know. Who was the first person that said, that looks yummy? It probably didn't look yummy after they boiled it. Anyway, moving on. But they ate what they were used to. And it was very limited. Back in the ancient, especially, they would get grains, and they were used to bread. Bread was a substance, a staple of life. Now, the Atkins diet comes out and says that the one thing that's a staple of life for centuries, for millennia, is no longer good for you. But in bygone days, the bread was what people lived off of. You didn't just go down and buy a porterhouse steak. Yesterday we did one of the first, we had a day of firsts. Now, I've killed chickens before, but our family, actually, I killed a chicken yesterday. dressed it. Courtney cooked it. We had some other things from the garden. She fried some squash. And we had basically a complete meal of just a farm meal. I mean, fresh, right then. I killed the chicken, we fixed it, and ate it. Okay? Tell you what, that was interesting. We enjoyed the meal. The meal was great. But it's work. Okay? It's work. Can you imagine doing that every day? I didn't pluck it, I skinned it. But the fact is that we have become spoiled with the conveniences that we have. You open a can, you open a freezer package, you open something that you bought at Walmart or a grocery store. That's our definition of food. But when it comes down to, in those days, not everybody owned herds of cattle. And you didn't have freezers. If you butchered, you had to eat it, consume it quickly, and which meant that later you didn't have. You follow what I'm getting at? So bread was something that was convenient, was readily accessible, was available to everybody. The poorest of people have bread. Bread was the equivalent of like rice in Asia or something of that nature. When Jesus begins to talk about the bread, his allusion back to the manna, his reference to bread was something that everybody would have been familiar with. Everybody had bread. The whole chapter is filled with imagery in John chapter 6 of bread. He talks about, this is the feeding of the multitude in John chapter 6. It says that the people were hungry. I want to talk, as we've talked about manna, I want to talk about how Christ fits into this. People were hungry. They were hungry for the bread. And Matthew chapter 5 verse 6 says, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." The bread was broken. He said, how much have we got? We got 5 loaves, 2 fish. What can we do with that? He blesses it. He prays over it. He gives thanks for it, and he breaks it. The Bible talks that he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you," in 1 Corinthians 11. Jesus' body was broken just as bread was broken. Filling of the multitude, as much as they would when they were filled. In other words, they ate until they were full. In this country, we have no problem eating until we're full. Many people around the world eat just enough, and they never know what it is like to be completely full. From this, you have 5 loaves, 2 fishes, fragments were gathered. What does this mean? Do you realize that there was more took up than was actually available? Right? There was 5 loaves, 2 fish. There were 12 baskets of leftovers took up. The 5 loaves and 2 fish would have fit in 1 or 2 baskets. 12 baskets were took up, which means that it had multiplied to the point that its influence spread farther than the need. Farther than even what was available to begin with. Jesus, when he came, was limited in his scope. Right? Jesus, when he first came, was limited. He was one man in a backwoods area of the world. One guy walking around preaching to as many people as he came in contact with. When he died and was resurrected, and the fragments that they were taken back up, it was multiplied in such a regard that it was more than was necessary. Jesus' influence is more now that he has died, buried, resurrected, and ascended than it was when he was alive. Why? Because when he was carrying the gospel, he was one. Now we all carry his gospel, and it is multiplied. Do you see what I'm saying? His influence after his death, burial, and resurrection is greater than his influence while he was alive. And we look at it and we say, why did he only have 3 years in ministry? 3.5 years. Because really what God was wanting was not Jesus' one-man influence on the planet. He was come to die for mankind. His influence was to be through us. It wasn't a oops. Oh, he only had 3.5 years, man. I messed up. He knew all along he intended to implement the church. God knew that the church would carry the influence of Christ. God knew that we, each one of us individually, would carry Christ's influence. Do you follow what I'm saying? And so when Jesus, he was only on the scene for 3.5 years in ministry, for what purpose? Because God knew that that was all the time it would take. God's not going to waste time. What would have been the point in having Christ live 60 years, 70 years? If it only took 3.5, he only used 3.5. That's how it works. And you will be alive as long as it takes. As long as it takes. You will not die until God's done with you. End of discussion. And you will not live past when God is done with you. Do you know that right now, as long as God is working, doing something with you, you're pretty much invincible. We don't look at it that way because we're frail and we're human, and we look at it and say, well, I can't do this, I better watch out for this. You will live as long as God has decreed for you to live. Now, where are we going with this? Manna. Everything in the Old Testament is to teach us something for the New Testament. God didn't just send Jesus and say, bam, I want y'all to believe in me as the Son of God, and he come up with this brand new religion. He didn't. He didn't just come in with something brand new and say, here, believe this. He had patiently, over centuries, taught little concepts, little ideas, little understandings that would build one on top of it. It's the same thing that you do with your kids, right? You don't teach them algebra ever. Yeah, exactly. You don't teach them algebra when you start off by teaching them, they start off having to learn to crawl, how to walk. When you start teaching them information, what do you teach them? We teach them their ABCs, right? You don't teach them to read. You teach them their letters first. You don't teach them complex trigonometry. You teach them numbers, right? They have to learn everything from nothing. God didn't just start off saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. He started off by teaching them from the very creation. There is a God. Right? He had to teach them that. How did he teach them that? How did Adam and Eve learn that? They experienced God. They walked with God. And then he taught them about relationships. They didn't understand any of that. Folks, we're failing our kids if we're not teaching them relationships. Relationships are hard for us to grasp because we're naturally self-centered. Relationships. He had to teach them relationships. He had to teach them little points that would eventually come together as one great truth. And that truth is Jesus Christ. It all pointed to Jesus. Right? How else would he have been able to stand up and say, I am the Son of God, and I expect you to believe that? John chapter 6, verse 30 through 35. They said therefore unto him, what sign showest thou then, that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. They kind of leave some of this out. The Pharisees are bad about this. They see things the way that they wanted to see it. They forget that their fathers got to a point where they hated the manna. Then Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Now, there is a reference here, and the reason I brought this together with our study in Exodus is because they reference the manna. We ate, our forefathers ate manna. What do you got to top that? That's what they're asking. What do you show us? Moses gave us manna. And Jesus said, Moses didn't give you manna. Moses didn't give you anything. See, what happened is that the people began to murmur and complain, as we've discussed before, against Moses and against Aaron. Oh, why'd you bring us out here? All we're going to do is starve to death. Moses didn't give them anything. God gave them everything. We look at people and we expect people to meet our needs. You cannot look at me and say, Ty, feed me. Ty, give me. Why? Because I got my own problems. I'm hungry too. Come on. Do you think that Moses was eating well in his tent and the rest of the people were starving? No. Moses was in the same boat as the rest of Israel. He looked around and said, I ain't got nothing to eat neither. They grumbled and complained against Moses, who was in the same boat as they are. We cannot look to another human being to supply our needs. End of discussion. Why did Jesus have to come? Because he had to be sinless. He had to be perfect. He had to come from heaven, because if he had the same needs we had, he could not meet ours. I have a need for somebody to pet me and love me and be nice and sweet to me. Guess what? So does every human being on this planet. Come on. Oh, I don't need that stuff. Yeah, you do. You let some, if you say you don't need it, it's because you're getting plenty of petting and plenty of loving and you don't recognize the need. But let somebody quit and your lip will poke out. And you'll get your feelings hurt. And you'll want to cry and cry because nobody's meeting your needs. The fact is, we all have needs. And too many of us have got our eyes on preachers, on teachers, on spouses, on co-workers, on somebody that we look up to meet our need, when really what we forget is that they have needs that need to be met as well. An interesting exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees in John 6, they reference the manna in the wilderness. They neglect to mention that they did not pray or petition God for their needs. They grumbled and complained. He says here, our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. They didn't ask for it. Did you notice that? Exodus chapter 16, they grumbled and complained about Moses. They did not ask God for anything. Moses went to God about it. And Moses was trying to lead the people in an example of how to petition God. Do you know what they learned? Did they learn to pray to God for their needs? No. They learned to grumble and complain about Moses. And then they got what they want. Do you know that there are ways that we actually learn wrong methods? We can learn wrong methods. One of the things when I was learning to play the guitar, one of the guys told me, you need to learn right. You need to make sure that you learn to make your chords the right way. Otherwise, when you go to move on to something a little more complex, you find out that what you learned, when you learned it the wrong way, makes it more difficult. You follow me? And so what happens is you have to unlearn what you had learned and try to do it a different way. And do you know that it is harder to adjust and unlearn than it is to learn it correctly the first time? What Moses was trying to teach the people was, don't come whining to me, go to God in prayer. The people learned, we grumble and complain. Moses goes to God in prayer. We get what we want. I don't have to work. That's what we have learned in this society. I whine, I complain, I grumble, somebody gives me to shut me up. How many people have heard the squeaky wheel gets the grease? They do. It does. You know what happens when you grumble, when you complain, when you whine, somebody gives you what you want just to shut you up. People learn that. And it becomes their natural first response. When actually there's a better way to go about it, and that is to work for it. The people learned incorrectly. In Numbers chapter 11, verse 6, let's see. I hadn't got quite there. Let me finish here. No, I'm going to go on over here. It says here that, right here, but now our soul is dried up. There is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. In other words, we're tired of this manna. We're tired of it. We're tired of eating this cornbread. We're tired of eating this that we have to see all the time. Now look at here. There is a comparison between Christ and the manna. Now, I downloaded this off the internet. I'm going to bring about something that I'm not exactly sure I completely agree with. It says John 6, comparison to manna. Manna is physical, Jesus is spiritual. Folks, Jesus was physical as well. You cannot accept Christ's spirituality without accepting His physicality. You follow me? The people hated the man as well as the message. They could not separate the two. Okay? We as Christians need to get to a point where they cannot separate us from our life. They cannot separate us from the message that we carry. They cannot separate us from our faith. When they see you, Jesus said that the earth, the people of the world will hate you. Well, we don't want to be hated. We want to be liked. But it's supposed to get to the point where they look at you and they can't stand to even be around you. And we get our feelings hurt by that. Don't we? And we look at it and go, what in the world's wrong with me? Christ in you, that's what's wrong with you. That's should be the fact that the world looks at you and they either see Christ or the world. Christians, they ought to see Christ. And your life should be so closely aligned with Christ that they can't see, well, I like Ty, but I hate his faith. If I'm close to Christ, if I'm as close to Christ as I can be, they will look at me and say, I don't want to be around him. Because all I see is Christ. The physical is so closely aligned with the spiritual. When you look here, huh?
I agree. I was just thinking, well, that you said that this is spiritual, but then you said this is also like physical. Well, manna is physical, but it's a heavenly physical.
It was of a spiritual source. No. See, and that's the reason I wasn't overly impressed with this dichotomy, where they separate one from the other. I believe that I believe in blended. I believe in unity. I believe that both comes together. You cannot live both lives. Jesus said you can't have these dichotomies. We want this. We want this pigeonhole where I've got church here and I've got my life. How many people hear that? If you don't hear it, how many people see that? I've got church life and then I've got my life. I've heard people say, well, that's church, this is business. Garbage. If your faith don't come into your business, then you ain't got a faith. Your faith should be reflected in your school and your schoolwork. Reflected in your relationship with your spouse. Your faith should be reflected in your relationship with your coworkers. It should be everything that you are. If it's not, then you need to be growing. We do not have a separate. Jesus said you can't love God and mammon. You can't serve two masters. You can't have one and the other. Eventually, one will beat out the other. James said, a double-minded man is unstable in every one of his ways, all of them. There will always be a time where you are a complete contradiction. And our society, that's all it is a complete contradiction. A complete contradiction. That's the reason nobody's happy. That's the reason nobody's content. Their entire life is trying to live to please somebody else and hold on to themselves. And you can't do it. You cannot be somebody else and yourself. I've seen this over and over and over. They go out and they buy the right jeans. Think back to your high school days, folks. You had to have the right pants. What is a pair of blue jeans? But all it had was a logo on the back of it, a patch, a stitch. Mine usually have a W for Wrangler. It started out because Kmart sold Wranglers and they were cheap. And Tough Skins were triple kneed so I wouldn't bust the knees out of my jeans. But I like Wranglers. But when I was growing up, Wranglers were not in. It was Levi's. And Levi's were the brand to have. And it didn't matter that my Wranglers covered me just as good as a pair of Levi's. The Levi's brand was what it meant. And you had to wear those. And you had to have the Nike Air tennis shoes that cost $125. And if you got the non-name brand, Cougas, from Pick and Pay Shoes, you were made fun of. Why? My feet were just as covered as theirs were, but it was the image. And these people became superly shallow in all it. I dress this way, I've got this image, but I'm an individual. No, you're not. You're a cookie cutter clone. You look just like everybody else. You got the same haircut. You got the same style. You live in the exact same style house. You drive the exact same style car. You are just like what the world has wanted you to be. And they live in that lifestyle. Lord help them if they go out looking the wrong way. Come on, you know these people. You see them. What liberty comes from just wearing what you want to wear and liking what you like to like and living the way Christ has called you to live with no guilt? Come on, no guilt, no sorrow. God calls you to live this way. You feel comfortable in the way He has called you to live, and you just live, and you are yourself. Besides these contradictions, this pigeonholing of one side versus the other, both have a heavenly origin, both available only to God's people, both sufficient to nourish in the wilderness, both obtained through a test of faith and obedience to God's instructions. This right here, I don't agree with. Mainly in both obtained through a test of faith and obedience to God's instructions. Christ came when God said it was time for Christ to come. The manna came. These people were not in faith. They were not following God's instructions. God blessed them in spite of themselves. And folks, if it wasn't for that, many a times we would go without a blessing. God blesses us in spite of us because we are not good enough to get His blessings. You cannot read your Bible enough. You cannot pray enough. You cannot live holy enough to get what God has for you. He blesses you in spite of you because we mess up. Sometimes we whine when we should pray. Sometimes we cry when we should laugh. Sometimes we are lazy when we should work. Come on. That's how it works. And God says, I love you, and I will bless you anyway. And then we get ourselves to the point where we learn these shortcuts and we still don't get what we need from God. But I will say this, the manna was supplied without obedience, but it could only be consumed through obedience. It was supplied out there on the ground. but they had to go gather it. Christ is there. He is available for anybody. But you have to go find Him. You have to go gather it. You have to become part of it. You have to accept it. Do you follow me? Too many of us are thinking that it just happens. It don't just happen. There's work involved. And there were some instructions. Don't keep it longer than I told you to keep it. There's some instructions for keeping Christ in your life too. Christ will not live where He is not welcome. And I don't care what people say. A Baptist will say, not a Baptist. I've been reminded there are different kinds of Baptists, and not all Baptists believe the exact same way. A Calvinist will say that once you're saved, you're always saved. Folks, they were told in the wilderness, you don't keep that manna overnight, or it'll breed worms and stink. And on the day before the Sabbath, you gather enough for 2 days' worth, and you'll have enough. Those were instructions, weren't they? There are instructions that come with Christ. He said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And God said, be ye therefore holy as I am holy. A holy life is necessary. Your salvation means nothing if you don't follow the instructions. The fact that you went out and gathered 4 truckloads of manna this morning means nothing in the morning. Because whatever you didn't eat out of them 4 truckloads spoiled overnight. And now the whole campus stunk up. Folks, there's too many people in the church running around stinking up the place with a moldy, wormy, nasty form that they call salvation. It's not. They're not keeping the instructions. And so what has happened is what may have been a genuine experience with God, they've let deteriorate, they've backslid, they've gotten to a point where it now stinks in the nostrils of God. And it stinks up the entire congregation. What do you mean it stinks up? You don't think that your spiritual condition affects me? Huh? It does. Your spiritual condition in this congregation will affect everybody around you. You don't think it's true? Let somebody in your house wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Let somebody wake up cranky. Or let somebody get hangry, hungry and angry. When you get mad, you just come home grumpy. Does it affect everybody in the house? Folks, we're a family. Whether we all like it or not, we're a family. And what you do affects me. You in a bad mood, you in a grump, you in a foul, you're not even right with the Lord at this moment, it affects me. And it affects everybody around you. Now, yes, ma'am.
I just want to give an illustration that flashed in my mind when you said that. I used to work in a Catholic hospital. I was not saved. I went to church regularly, but for months. And I was a roving manager for several different nursing floors, and nursing stations can be large, sprawling areas with nursing staff, lab technicians, X-ray technicians, physicians, all kinds of people coming and going, coming and going. And I remember one day they were being a little bit scary. One of the nuns came through, and she had a job in the hospital. She was a nurse nun. She came in and she sat down. Everything changed. And she wasn't a phony. She was a genuinely good, devout person. Just her presence dispelled everything else that was going on. Behavior, I mean, it was like children being caught with their hand in a cookie jar or something, you know?
Right.
But that's what I think of when you said that. You know, one person can make a huge difference.
They can. For both good and for ill.
Yes. This morning,
very thankful. I like most of everything. But in every sermon, he has to say, God save you, don't let nobody take you. Say, be there for eternity. And I said, I disagree. This is right on what you're talking about today. I said, I disagree because God has instructions and rules to follow. And if you're in his way, he's going to proceed to go the right way. Now, you know, we all know that you can turn around and ask forgiveness. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to start going the right way. And then I thought, how many people are PCC? Because I'm not people that really believe.
Right.
They're out there sinning every day and they really believe, I'm saved.
Sure.
I'm going to make it. When somebody dies, everybody goes to heaven. But that's not true.
Well, and think about it in the terms of this with the manna. The manna was supplied every day. But if you gathered a whole, you said, okay, I'm going to gather enough that I don't have to gather anymore. I gathered plenty. Tomorrow, your manna is full of worms and stinks. You say, well, I'm going to eat it anyway. I'm going to keep holding on to this. Eventually, you will starve, slammed to death, and completely surrounded by manna. That's what will happen. Eventually, you will starve to death desurrounded by food. And spiritually speaking, it is the same. If you do not have Christ, it says His mercies are renewed day by day. We have to cling to not His mercies yesterday, but His mercies today. If it was not necessary, He would not say that His mercies were renewed day by day. But it says that they are, so we cling to His mercies today. Jesus said, give us this day our daily bread. Yesterday's bread, not give me tomorrow's bread. Give me this day my daily bread. Give me my sustenance today. And if you're living off of what you got yesterday, you can starve, slam to death. Grace, mercy, and love of Jesus Christ. And you will find yourself death in the Scripture. Spiritual death is represented of one who is outside of the faith. And if there is something to eternal security, live like that. I seen a little feller, eyes welled up with tears and said, I don't want to go to hell. I'm scared to go to hell. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to live not sure. Jesus said, keep my commandments. I reckon He meant what He said. And if I'm doing the best I can, and then I'm relying on His grace to be sufficient for all of it, then I don't have to be scared of hell. Do you follow me? To finish up. No, I'm done. We'll finish up next time. Does anybody have anything to add? Any comments, questions, hymnals to throw? If not, let's change the order of service for prayer.